story.
Great, thank you, James. Megumi?
Hi, everyone. My name is Megumi. I am in the Twin Cities. I work as a quality engineer. I joined AFSP after losing my sister Mari to suicide last year. And I'm happy to be part of this conversation too.
Thank you, welcome. Ravi?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ravi Maney from Houston, Texas. I am a father and husband as well. I work in the offshore engineering, offshore oil and gas engineering, as well as I have my own virtual experiences company. And I came to the foundation through my best friend who died by suicide 3 years ago. I'm very excited to be part of the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ravi. And Samira?
Hi, my name is Samira and I live in Houston, Texas. I came to know about AFSP in 2017 when I lost my younger brother at 18 years old, and I currently do not work. I'm pregnant with twin boys, and I feel very grateful to be here today as a person and to be a part of this discussion.
Great. Wonderful, wonderful, and thank you all again for being with us today and taking the time out to share your stories. So as we mentioned earlier, it is Minority Mental Health Month, and so we wanted to.
Hey, Waukesha, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think that there's some kind of a delay. Are you all hearing it, or is it just on my end?
I'm not hearing a delay at all.
Okay, I'm going to get back off then. Maybe it's my computer. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. So as we mentioned, to start over, as we mentioned, July is Minority Mental Health Month, and we wanted to take the time to talk about the experience of a survivor of suicide loss from the BIPOC perspective. And so we'll start this conversation with the first question that I have for our panelists today. How has race or ethnicity played a role in your experience with mental health and suicide? We can start in the same order, or if there's anyone that would like to go first, please let me know. All right, James, you're up. Unmute yourself.
Would you mind repeating the question? I'm sorry.
How has race or ethnicity played a role in your experience with mental health and suicide?
Well, you know, it's really tough to sort of delineate all the times that race plays a role personally. I'm sure it had, I come from a Black family, an interracial family. I'm sure the same stigma that suicide had or has with other ethnic communities, or you know, any community is still there. So I guess stigma was there, and if it had a racial component, and we weren't heavily religious as a family, so there was no sort of stigma there, but just the sort of general stigma that comes in society, that society has. Sorry, I'm not articulating it very well, but yeah, that's probably the most personal way that it affected me.
Okay. Megumi?
Well, even though I'm in the Twin Cities in Minnesota now, I actually grew up in suburban Texas, which is predominantly white. There were other Asians, of course. But yeah, I think the way being Asian impacted my mental health and my sister's mental health the most is just that distinct feeling of being different. It's not, there are a couple there wasn't overt racism, but you know, when I think back to like when I was bullied, I can't help but think if being Asian or being a different race factored into that. So that kind of in a nutshell, I think that's how it's impacted my mental health.
Ravi?
Mute. For me, from the broad general strokes of it, I'm Indian American, first generation born here. My parents came here more than 40 years ago, and in 1972. Being from Houston, I was raised in a part of town that I was the only Indian in my community until I was well into high school, and there were times where you felt a little bit of racism and it played on you, but for the most part, the way I was raised, I kept a pretty tough exterior for it. But ultimately, the taboo that surrounds the Asian culture when it comes to mental health and suicide is profound. I mean, even at a young age, for my own children, my wife doesn't like talking about death in any form or fashion to the kids, just in a way to almost shield them from hearing something negative. And if you take it to the level of suicide, no one ever wants to talk about it. So it isn't a conversation that's had when you're young. It's not a conversation you have when you're old. It's the thing that will never happen to us, and it will never happen to our family. And unfortunately, it can slap you in the face, and just like any other type of death, it's God's available option in many ways. And the reason behind it is obviously mixed for everybody. But yes, it's the general taboo of just suicide in general with death in general is where my culture and upbringing has been.
Samira?
Well, I come from a Hispanic background. So, and where I grew up in Houston, I live in Southeast Houston, which is predominantly heavily Hispanics and a lot of immigrants, of course. And we're taught at a very young age as kids that to keep all those feelings inside and carry pride, and if you show any form of vulnerability to anybody, it just gives people a reason to come at you in a negative aspect. And if you're young and you feel these emotions, a lot of times parents they think in their mind is shielding you, and they try to tell you it's not real, it's in your mind, it's an excuse, they'll tell you it's just not a real thing, that you don't know any experience till you get older. But the unfortunate thing about why we're here today is because those situations did happen. We did go through those experiences, whether we admit them or not. And it makes it very hard to still come out of it and be open. And for, like I said, and as a Hispanic, we're also taught not to complain what we got going on. Just keep it, shield it, save it for another time when you're by yourself.
Okay. And Samira, I'm gonna go back from end to beginning this time and talk about your experience with mental health treatment. And did you feel the providers were adequately understood and addressed your experiences?
So it took me a couple of months to come to realize that I do need help. I did take time to research on therapists and what I really wanted in a therapist, because as I was researching, I learned that some therapists are not qualified in certain areas. Some are mostly for like marriages or teens or tragedies. So I had found a therapist, and she was amazing. She's helped me over the last 3 years, and it really came down to about me and how I was feeling, and the part that her goal was to find my trigger, where my roots had set, and she, over time, she did help a lot. We've had tons of conversations where it cleared up my mind, and I didn't feel so dark anymore.
Yeah. So, okay. And so Samira, Ravi, So now I have to practice the alphabetical order from the other end.
So for me, my approach was a lot different. I'm not saying my maturity or my experience in life played a role or anything like that. I mean, clearly it would have, but ultimately, I never sought out therapy. I never sought out speaking to anyone about it. My wife tried quite a bit to get me to talk those first several weeks, months, to get me to talk about it. And I internalized everything. But ultimately, I was the person that processed it on my own. The one thing that I knew in my own heart is that no matter who I spoke to, no matter what I did, I wasn't going to get the answer that was going to be satisfactory to me because he was gone. And that was my internal struggle. I'm sure that there are enough people in this world that could relate very, very closely to what I've gone through. And I don't negate that fact and I don't put that fact to the side. It's just ultimately in my heart of hearts is I'm never going to get the answer that I want. I can talk about it till I'm blue in the face, and all I do is relive the moment over and over again. So my piece was knowing that as unfortunate and heartbreaking as his decision was final, and I had to let that be his final note. He did write a letter to me. I did read that letter. I could pull up the emotion right now if I needed to, but it's not that I pack it down deep. It's just I've learned to coexist with it, and I came to that on my own. I know that there is plenty of help out there. I know that there is therapy that I could essentially go to. I've just chosen to live my life this way, and I've made my peace enough to be able to keep myself together and be strong for my family and let them be strong with me. I have my moments. I speak to my wife. She gives me a hug, and you know, I'm able to move on to the next day, the next minute, the next hour, the next day.
Good. Well, and you bring up a great point, Ravi. Even though we are talking kind of, even though we're having this panel discussion about different groups, different ethnic groups, we are all still individuals. And so our experiences from one person to the other, from one race to the other, from one individual to individual is going to be different. And what our needs are is going to be different as well. And so it's important that we also keep that in the back of our minds. It's important to definitely share in these discussions to learn about our experiences, because this is how we improve on the care and support that we provide to other people. But always keep in your mind that we're all individuals. So what works for one person may or may not work for the other, and
Absolutely.
we can get some tips from everybody. Thank
Absolutely.
you. Megumi?
So I was actually the opposite of Robbie. After my sister passed, I was obsessive. I was just in it. I read books. I found support groups. I spoke with the director of the Minnesota Center of Suicidology. I was fortunate that there were so many different ways to connect with others, to learn. And but from specific to that question about mental health, like therapists and counselors and whether they adequately address, I've been lucky and I've felt like they've been equipped to talk about all the complexities of my mental health. I've found, even if my therapist isn't Asian, they were able to acknowledge and address that. Actually, my current therapist was like, you know, you and your family didn't have a community. You're a first generation immigrant. So it's not like you had roots. You don't have extended family living here. You don't have a church. And that definitely adds to your isolation. And I did not even think about that. And that was an important piece for me to kind of cut my family and myself a little bit of slack. Just knowing that we are different and we had these added challenges because we were immigrants, that made the grief so much harder. And from my sister's standpoint, I don't think she sought out Asian therapists, but I know she had different issues. She had trichotillomania, which, if you're not familiar, she is kind of compulsive anxiety-induced hair pulling. So all the therapists, she reached out to, I think, 20. And they all pointed her to the trichotillomania specialist. And the trichotillomania specialist said, well, I think your problems are rooted in childhood. And they just kind of bounced her around. And from that standpoint, I really think the mental health support really failed her. So like you said, we're all individuals. We have different specific individual needs. And kind of where I'm hopeful is if you are the kind of person that does need support from others, there's a lot of different ways to get it. It doesn't just have to be therapy if you're not comfortable at it. It can be groups. Even sitting in those groups, listening to different nuggets of wisdom can be helpful. I found a lot of comfort in books, those late nights. So we are fortunate that we live in an online connected world where I know people in the past did not have access to that. So
awesome. We're going to talk some more about those resources that were helpful to you in a few minutes. James, why don't you share your experience?
It was similar to Ravi's. As a husband and father, I had my personal family to think of how his passing affected them. I had, my biological family, my mom, my dad, my remaining brothers, and then just my own personal processing. So I think I took sort of a natural approach. If feelings arose, I let them, arise. And sometimes it manifested itself at work or at home. You become sometimes a belligerent truth teller, or just belligerent. But I sought things like yoga. I had done yoga before. I had a lot more massages done. I had a lot of chiropractic done, even colonics. Because, it was definitely internalized, and I was immersing myself in music. I don't play, but I'm an avid listener, and I connected with Brian's memory through media in a way, documentaries, comedies, dramas, and music. And ultimately, I made my own documentary about my personal investigation into his passing and the fallout and accelerated deaths of my parents that were part of it.
Okay, great. So like Ravi, like you said, your experience was very similar to Ravi in that you looked to not so much as the professional support, but found support in your family networks and your social networks that was really helpful and therapeutic for you. And then I also heard mention of music, and I heard mention of media, and just finding different ways to express your grief, in a helpful and healthy way in the form of your documentary. So thanks for producing that. And we're going to ask you some more about that as well. And just to share a little bit about my experience in mental health treatment, I think in hindsight, I've been a survivor of suicide loss now for 16 years. And initially, I think seeking mental health care was so new to me that I wasn't really prepared for what to look for. I didn't know what to find, what to ask, or what to really even, what questions I should be asking a therapist about my care and my treatment. And so I didn't feel well informed. I did find that it was difficult to find a counselor that looks like me, or even how important it was to have a counselor that looks like me. And so in the mental health field, there's a very limited number of counselors, or of BIPOC counselors. And research and studies, there have been so much research and studies that show that it's important to have that representation in the mental health field in order to break down the gap in access to care. And so it's been a personal mission of mine to continue to shed light on that there needs to be more access to mental health professionals that are people of color, that are BIPOC, that are in the BIPOC population, so that more people will feel comfortable with accessing care. But also being mindful of the fact that the traditional one-to-one therapy talk may not necessarily be the thing for everyone, and so it really is just about figuring out what works well for you. Now, 16 years later, having had some experience with mental health professionals, I know what questions to ask. And I've had several different therapists, and the one that I have now is excellent, but it was more so kind of like dating. You kiss a lot of frogs until you find the prince, right? And so finding a good counselor is kind of the same way. You date a little bit and you figure out what works well for you and what doesn't. To go back into talking about community and family, which are big support systems for James and Robbie, let's talk about how your community and family, how mental illness is treated, and also how, how mental illness and even kind of how their approach to suicide is within your within your cultures. And so, James, we'll go with you again and we'll move down the line.
Well, let's see. So I'm mixed with the Irish and English, in addition to African American.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a household where you just said there wasn't a whole lot of taboo. I mean, people would, it was maybe even dysfunctional that way, the way we just sort of wore our heart on our sleeves and spoke our mind. But I mean, expression was better than repression. I think I felt that. And so, I mean, I think the suicide of Brian was still the white elephant in the room. Maybe not even white. I think my mom sort of had always liked true crime as a bad, maybe this doesn't fit, but she had she was a nurse, a hospice nurse. So she was interested in sort of practical, pragmatic means of tracing cause. And I think before she passed, she was really wanted to know what antidepressant he was on or what he had been prescribed. So that in a way I took the baton and picked up where she couldn't find that out. So suicide itself, the word was, it was so pronounced when the family would get together, the missing, leg of the table. So yeah, like I said, it was addressing his suicide directly and talking about it as a family wasn't something that occurred, ironically, for a family that talked about everything. But when it was spoken of, it was about how can we get to the root of this and see what maybe the causation was of the ideation. Yeah.
Okay. Megumi, how about you? How is mental health addressed within your community, your family, and suicide?
With mental health, I remember my sister told me that she had gone to my mother and mentioned that she thinks she needs to see a counselor, and my mom convinced her out of it. And obviously my mom never meant harm, but unintentionally, right? It was kind of a signal of like, no, you don't need that. And within Japanese culture specifically, it's common for Japanese people to never want to burden others. So my sister definitely felt that she was the support person for a lot of people, really made them feel welcome, but she had the hardest time reaching out for help. And that was very hard on her. Simultaneously, Japanese specific, there's this concept of gamanzuru, which is just you suck it up. You suck it up, you push through, That's something my mom said all the time. You know, everybody has troubles sometimes, but you suck it up and you push through. And I trying to be that intermediary, be like, Mom, I don't think that's it. Like, I think she literally has something like a mental health issue, and she still struggles with that. With that said, I mean, they didn't stop my sister from going to therapy eventually, but I think they saw that it didn't help her as much as they expected. With suicide, my parents and I are polar opposites. They're very private about it. I feel the need to talk about it all the time, which is hard for me because, again, it's kind of lonely. She was my only sister, and I want to respect the way my parents grieve. I have no idea what it's like to lose a child. I can't even imagine. And they've managed to deal with it in their own way. But my mother told me a couple stories about how much stigma there is in Japan, and just things like she had a friend who confessed that her sibling or a good friend died of suicide and then was subsequently shunned later. So my mom holds that knowledge, even though she's in America, and our neighbors have been very kind. We're not even close with our neighbors, but we've been pleasantly surprised with how supportive they are. But still, she holds that stigma. And you know, I have a Facebook memorial page for my sister because I want to remember her. I want others to remember her, but my mom is still uncomfortable with it. And I generally like to respect my parents and others' boundaries and their wishes, but this is one thing that I put my foot down on and say, no, she deserves to be remembered, and I'm not ashamed of the way she died. So yeah, a lot of tension within my family and my culture.
So Megumi, for you, the tension between your family and your culture sounds like where you're trying to find that happy medium between being respectful of what they need, but also being aware of what you need in your grief process as well, you know, and finding that balance, you know, similar. And I think that you know, when there are individuals when people are new to having lost someone to suicide, they'll all kind of go through that process of trying to figure out what works best for me and what works best for the family, you know, and then what works best for the community as a whole. And it is kind of a teeter-totter, you know, and balancing the scales on a regular basis and trying to figure out what works well. You know, but at the end of the day, like you said, we're all individuals and each of us grieve in a different kind of way. And so finding a way to respect those grief processes is important. Thank you. Ravi?
In a lot of ways, my story is not that different than Megumi's. I am, as I said, I'm Indian American, but my best friend is Korean American. He's first generation born in the United States. He was born in Texas. He was my brother from another mother, if you will. And we shared the same birthday, just 1 year apart. I was 1 year older. We met in college, and it was like we'd known each other our whole lives. When he died, his family took it the traditional Asian way, for lack of better words. They basically circled around themselves, pulled themselves together, and huddled down. And they chose not to announce his death. And if anybody had heard of it, they gave another reasoning. They did not mention suicide at all. I was to tell people, I was the gatekeeper for the family. Everybody had to go through to me before they could speak to the parents, and I shielded most of the people from asking anything. I was told to tell anybody it was a sudden heart attack. He lived outside of the country with his fiance and his unborn child, and it was tough for them. They went there for essentially to meet the police and talk, and then they came back, and that was the end of it. They moved. We helped sell their house. They moved, and they relocated to another state. And I've spoken to his brother, his younger brother, a couple of times since it happened, but for the most part, it's just move on. For the first year and a half, I respected their wishes. I didn't talk about it. I didn't announce anything. I quietly told a few people, if you really need to know, come talk to me. But outside of that, there was an epiphany one day, and much like Megumi said, I just couldn't do it anymore. It wasn't right. It wasn't right to forget him like that. It wasn't right to not try to save one other person from having to either have that happen to them in and of itself, or to let another family member grieve the way that we've all had to grieve.
Right.
And so it became a fire and passion within. Much like I said, before, my wife did everything that she could to support me, and she saw my fire and she supported it. And that's when I found the foundation and started doing whatever I could to raise money, raise awareness. I'm also a first responder, so that's a whole different caveat and a whole different lane to go down. But suicide is unfortunately all too prevalent. And the blessing and the curse of being in a social media world and a internet world is we now know how apparently obvious it is that it happens all the time. And that's a good thing and a scary thing, because people don't necessarily get ideas, but they get ideas. So it's a very confusing thing for the old traditional family members, where when they came from the motherland, were told to keep it in, suck it up, move on, don't talk about it. It's not going to happen to us. And now in a world where our generation is so involved in media that we can't escape it. And so that's where I respect the fact that they don't want to talk about it, but I have nothing but everything in front of me to put it out there. So just like Megumi says, you battle that respect of wanting to respect what they want and what they need. But what about what I need? And what about what I need to do to make it better for me? I've got to live my life. And so I still respect them as much as I can, but I had to move my own way.
Yeah. And again, you mentioned, you mentioned, well, not again, but you mentioned also being a community gatekeeper. And we're going to get into some discussion about that for a few minutes before we close today. But, some of those messages that you heard culturally, keep it in. You don't talk about it. You don't mention it. You just hunker down and deal. Those are some of the same messages that I heard within my family. My parents, my father still won't and still does not like to talk about the fact that my brother died by suicide. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard him say that my brother died by suicide. And my mother for many years said that he was sick and he died from being sick, and kind of that was the gist of it. Now, at the same time, a little dissimilar from what you and Megumi described, my parents also love the fact that I do this work. And that I speak openly about it. I think it kind of got to the point where they were like, look, she's going to talk about it anyway. We just can't fight on it, And so they were like, we're just going to have to let her win this one. But they do love the fact that I talk to people about it, and that even though they're not able to, for some of those same reasons, because culturally you don't talk about mental illness, and you don't talk about depression, and you don't talk about suicide, and so even though they don't feel comfortable with openly speaking about it yet, they are very happy and comfortable with the fact that I am, and a part of that, again, I think is just finding resolve that this was just something I wasn't gonna fight about, and so it was just like, this is what I need to do for myself, and this is what I need to do to help other people, and this is also a great way to remember my brother. Samira, how about you?
This question specifically probably runs me deep, because I grew up in a small area, and I have some family members that are very open-minded, and then I have some that are still stuck in the old generation culture and religion. The last 10 years, when I was about 13 up until I was 18, I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. And, my siblings and I we just held on each other so tight. So we were familiar with what was wrong with each other. And my brother did show signs at an early age, and we try to, be open with our parents about it, specifically more our mom, because that's who we were living with. And it was like, no, that's not that's not how you really feel. It's because of somebody else, or you have to just let it go. And and it had a, it's kind of like, well, if I can't talk to who's supposed to be there for me, who's supposed to love me indefinitely, who am I supposed to talk to? Because my siblings are in the same boat with me. So at 18, he did die by suicide. And some people were like so shocked. And it was like, for us siblings, it was like, well, it wasn't a huge shock to us. It just hurted us so much and so deep that we could have been better. Someone could have helped us if it wasn't for the mindset of people, or our, specifically with parents, that it's not real. You're just a kid. You don't know anything. And I think, but it's like, I'm trying to keep telling you that I'm hurting, and I don't know. And it's not having to be anything physical either, because a lot of times parents can be like, well, you have a better life than some people like this and this and that, but I'm still struggling up here. Is the problem, and my mind and my heart can't be on the same page. So after he had passed, I had family members say, that's a sin, he was just a coward. And I was just shocked. And I was like, oh no. I was kind of the outspoken one, and I set my foot down. I wasn't going to let anybody disrespect my siblings, especially my brother. And I said, you know what? At the end of the day, this was your nephew. This was your friend. This was a 18-year-old, a young person at this age, and he had a whole life, but he lost his battle. And as an older sister at that, I seen him grow up his whole life, and it's like, you don't have any room to say. If you as a person can't see a human being as another human being who has life and can breathe and can have a heart and create another life, then you don't need to say anything.
Right.
Have respect for the families, for the grievers, and everybody else. Don't try to put your 2 cents in it because you think you have an opinion.
You said that was a strong message right there. You can have your 2 cents and your opinions, but be mindful of the fact that there are people that are grieving that loss, and regardless of what the personal opinion is, regardless of what the cultural aspect is, there's a family that lost somebody that they love. So so the focus should be then providing care and support to that family, that loved one, that boyfriend, that girlfriend, that best friend, regardless of what your feelings are about whether suicide is right or wrong, whether it shows weakness or not, or whatever the case may be. At the end of the day, there are people who were touched by that person while they were here, and those people need to be loved on, and so as humans and as people, and folks that should have some level of humanity, keep your opinions to yourself and just provide support. And I think that message can go across the board, across any culture. So definitely with that. So we talked a little bit about, everyone mentioned some of the things that they accessed and had that they used to kind of help them with their grief and their loss. We heard about counseling, and we've heard about even just relying on your family and your friends and things like that. What other resources have you used? What mental health resources has been most helpful to you or your family, or even with your community with getting involved? And we're gonna jump back over to you, James. I like to shake it up a little bit.
Sure. So I did a lot of self coping, if that's a thing. I mentioned the yoga and chiro, but there was bicycling, and then there was walks, and I think I'd heard of the AFSP's walk somewhere. It took me about 5 years to sort of unpack and process my brother's death, but yeah, unfortunately for my parents, they just slipped into their ailments. They sort of were accelerated by his suicide, and I've got a brother that probably bottled it up, and then another that went into walks and ended up divorcing in his marriage. So yeah, I think ultimately I knew that I needed to address it, and I just addressed it, but it took about 5 years. And somebody at my place of work mentioned AFSP and Eric Arveseth, and so I thought I'd at least interview somebody that was in the mix and had an experience. And then that just led down the road of interviewing my brothers and then looking inward, discussing it with my daughter and my family. So it was just uncorking the bottle, and I just started with a professional, not in a patient kind of client way, but just interviewing somebody that was associated with suicide prevention.
Okay.
Yeah, that's about it.
So it sounds like, James, that your desire to learn more about suicide and kind of, like you said, uncorking the bottle and really digging into those layers has been a good process for you to be able to work through your own loss, but also just to gain a larger understanding in suicide in general.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if that's even a pedagogical thing. I teach, and so I think I'm methodical that way, and ultimately, it led to a film, but that wasn't on the horizon at all. It was just becoming. Yeah, I think I provide solutions. I'm an editor, so clients come to me, they need this, that, and how can they do it? It's basically always on me to sort of collaborate and get to how I can help. So I think I applied that to the loss of my brother.
And what is the name of your film?
Master Jam.
Master Jam.
Master Jam. Those were names of cassettes that Brian and I used to make as mixes off the radio. It's also a Shaka Khan and Rufus album.
Yeah. I'm gonna say you're telling our age now, because I know what mixtapes are and I know how to make mixed cassette tapes. So that definitely comes from our generation.
I guess mixed CDs even, but
with mixed CDs too.
You can tell by the two faces that are not laughing that they're not old enough to know what's going on.
I know what a mixtape is.
Well, Megumi, because since you're unmuted, tell me about you. What other resources have you used?
So again, I'm a talker, so I love groups, but I just want to say, even if you're not a talker, online groups, support groups in person, I feel like you get so much out of it just because seeing somebody else who is just emanating peace. One of the grief group facilitators, he had lost his daughter by suicide when she was 12. And he is so at peace. And I see him and I think maybe I can get there. But yeah, online too. This might sound a little odd, but, and I know it's a little controversial, but TikTok, I get a lot of supportive, wholesome videos on TikTok, and I see a lot of Native American representation, a lot of BIPOC representation on there, and just seeing them love themselves really uplifts my day. And Instagram too, just there's all these groups that I didn't even think to follow or be part of. I didn't really think about my Asian identity and how that factored into my grief and mental health until recently. I found out that there's an Asian mental health Facebook group that I joined. And it's really nice to know that there's this space, this safe space where I could talk about issues specific to my Asian identity. So you just have to remind yourself that you're not alone, and there are resources for any kind of niche or different kind of group that you feel that you could be a part of. You just have to remember to look for them. So,
think
I
that's an
mean,
important point, Megumi. Yeah. I think that's an important point to show folks that for folks to not sleep on the internet and social media and access to, different forms of help and resources and care. There are websites, there are internet groups, there's TikTok, there's YouTube, there's so much out there. One of the things that frustrated me the most as a new survivor was that, listen, I grew up in the age of Yahoo and dial-up AOL. So trying to find anything in that realm was just different, and so there's access to things. I think we today have access to so much more information and resources than we would have been able to easily access back then. And even though it's only been 16 years, things have changed so much. But it's a matter of making sure that folks are aware that they have access to that, and so really having these conversations and talking to different groups and different people to say, hey, have you tried Facebook groups? Like just Google, Survivor of Suicide Loss group or Asian mental health, or anything like that. And you can find quite a few resources. Robbie, any resources that were helpful for you?
So like I said earlier, in concurrence with James, I guess in the back of my mind, I knew then and I know now that there's a web underneath me to catch me if I fall. But for me, I had to do this for myself in my mind. And as we were saying earlier, everybody's a little bit different, but I had to mentally, for me, get through this or I wouldn't survive. And so knowing that maybe that there was a net underneath me to catch me from healthcare professionals, of friends, family, other entities, I think that probably gave me a little bit of safe harbor to be able to pass and try to do this. But for me, it was much more something that I had to come of age in. I had to pass through. And so through that, I have never really, like I said earlier, I've never really gone to therapy. I've only talked to my wife and my quiet time to myself, but I've used my religion, I've used my faith, I've used my experience in life, my knowledge and what I can pull from it to be able to get through. And that's pretty much how I've managed to use my mental health to stay sane and keep going.
Okay. Samira, what other resources have you looked to?
Well, I would first exercise a lot. I feel like a bit it's aside from just finding a group or a community to have that free air in. I at first was started with exercise because I was completely alone. I didn't have very supportive friends. It was too depressing for them. I couldn't, of course, my siblings are in the same boat with me. And it's like people that say they know me, but only know of me, not actually know me, or just being nosy rosies about the whole situation. It was very frustrating. My partner at that time also was like, you just have to put it aside. So I was completely alone, and I had found the organization online through a Out of Darkness walk was first. And and it was in the Houston area, and a past friend had also passed away a few months later, and I was friends with, we were really great friends, and me and his older sister had decided to go to the walk together, and I was so shocked about the booths and the resources that were there. And so I kind of just looked more into it after I went there, because I didn't realize I was going in for more than what I thought I was getting. And I was seeing everybody else putting these hearts out and hearing the speaker that day. And I think the part that really stuck out to me that day with that speaker was she didn't tell me, but she told in her speech that there's not a mold of what someone looks like that has these thoughts or these feelings. And that really stuck to me, and it's very much true. So then I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna try, because I felt like I needed to do something. I can never just, I like to fidget, and I I had to do something. I couldn't just keep it internally. I was already alone. I was like, well, what do I got to lose at this point? Ain't nothing gonna hurt me anymore. So I went out for it. I had looked for therapy, but aside from that, I do write a lot. I've always been a writer since I was little, and I exercise. I saw a lot of health books, and then also the biggest thing was I was reintroduced to religion, and that gave me a lot of spiritual relief that I felt like I had lost, that I was never going to have that hope again or faith in myself, or just feeling like I was going to make it again. So, I mean, for others who feel completely alone and don't feel comfortable to, outreach, maybe it just takes one time for them to do it on their own, because I know some people don't also like hearing you need help, you need help, you need help, or you should talk to someone. You should talk. A lot of people don't like that, because I didn't like it myself. Like I need to have my own steps to get there.
Gotcha. And I think that those non kind of technical things that seem like very small, minute things in our lives, but they're so powerful in helping us, like exercise, like eating right, like, your faith. If faith is something that helps you to get through your times of crisis, and really just kind of being creative. It may very well be just coloring in the coloring book. I can't tell you how many times and how many coloring books I filled just to be able to clear my mind so I can get through the day. And so I think that one of the things, before we're going to get ready to close in a few minutes, and before we close, what I would like to share is that as survivors of suicide loss, and as someone who is openly, and as someone who openly discusses everything, we're all community gatekeepers, or who openly discusses our loss and how we've been affected by it. That all makes us community gatekeepers, and we become a resource to our communities. And so I want to thank you all for being a resource to your communities, whatever those communities they be they physical or online, or all girls, all guys, or 80s babies, or whatever, And so whatever those communities are, I just want to thank you for being the gatekeepers, but also remember to keep a balance and take care of yourself as well. And with that, Cammie, I'll turn it over to you to close.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much. For sharing your story. In closing, we all have a role to play. And we invite you to join us in preventing suicide among underrepresented communities and creating change in mental health equity. AFSP will continue to speak out and advocate for greater access to healthcare, and especially mental health care for people of color and anyone needing support. I'm going to share my screen right now because we've got a couple of resources. Hopefully everybody can see that. We're going to put this in the YouTube chat box as well, but we've got resources around mental health. We've got some great resources around COVID-19. We also included some resources from Megumi that she shared. And again, don't worry about trying to write these down. We'll share them in the YouTube chat box. We just are really urging everyone listening to do what it takes to safeguard their mental health as we continue to navigate through COVID. I know that in listening to you all talk about hope and healing and what helped for you all, several of you guys mentioned the Out of the Darkness events. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Last year we had more than 250,000 people across the country join us to raise awareness, to raise funds that can save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. We know that this is a different year, and the events this year are going to look a little bit different, but our mission to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide has not changed. So I would encourage everybody listening right now to visit our website at afsp.org/walks to find out about what our Out of the Darkness experience is going to look like for you and your community. So thank you again to all of our panelists, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Bye.